What do you register when you see these photos? Is it the hills, the people, the road, the signs? How about the sky or the ground? There are aspects of everyday life humans are so close to, so intertwined with, it can be hard to fully register the extent of our relationship with them without critical reflection, or without a moment where we are confronted with imbalance, disconnect, where hidden threads unravel, where the risk of modern magics becomes reality. For me, and many others, that moment manifests as disaster. I was staying on the border of Pasadena and South Pasadena, back from school for winter, when the flames started. Very quickly, me and thousands of others were confronted with the overlooked risk of living in an electrified space at what fire ecologists call the wildland-urban interface. The question that arose in my mind was, who was responsible? Who was managing this risk? This question assumed a singular answer, however, and stemmed from an assumption that there was a singular and homogeneous entity who managed this risk. In reality, as disaster anthropologists have already explored, disasters start long before their most violent manifestations, like the first spark to find fuel, and last long after into the slow violence of recovery. As Susanna Hoffman has stated, quote, "A great many more people survive catastrophes than are killed by them. When the dust settles, the water recedes, and the ashes take flight in the wind, the survivors are left in pieces. A world that was solid has turned friable." The question I will try to address, knowing that the disaster has not ended, is how risk and responsibility is distributed unevenly throughout the electrical grid of Altadena. Knowing that there are ways humans interact with our world that we accept as natural or the only possibility, where do the multifaceted risk relationships come from? While this video was produced for the Energy Infrastructures Conference in St. Andrews, it is by no means exclusively for this event. I will explore risk and responsibility through an anthropological lens, recognizing that anthropology's reach can be limited by academic language. This video is an attempt to interpret deep anthropological reflection by academics to a broader audience. What anthropology, in my opinion, is particularly good at is analyzing the messy intertwinings of human life with larger structures, like the legal and material structures of California's electrical grid, economic policies like financialization or public ownership, and non-humans like trees, fire, and animals. Anthropology can be hard to define. What it means to me, as an anthropology student, is the exploration of what it means to be human. It is an attempt to explore the things that are widely accepted, taken for granted, described as inherent, query the assumptions we hold on the way we live, all while recognizing that all things human are extensions of the past, of shared history, and are constantly moving and changing in the present. There may be threads that tie things together, sociological labels or general terms that are useful for looking at the madness of humanity, but these do not provide the answer or the solution. What anthropology is, for me, is an act of gathering moments and perspectives into a carrier bag rather than hunting down the truth. This allows for a better reflection of the interconnected experience of humanity.
The American dream has always run on energy, cheap, abundant power, a bounty that most Americans took for granted.
Before moving forward and following the historical development of California's grid, I would like to quickly define some terms and acronyms that I may use throughout the video. Southern California Edison, or SCE, is one of the 3 massive investor-owned utility companies in California. Investor-owned utility means that instead of a government entity setting rates and managing the transportation of electricity, gas, or water, it is a private board with shareholders to think of. SCE is a subsidiary of the larger corporation, Edison International, who also owns the energy advisory company, TRIO. I will explore their history in relation to the electrical grid later on. When I refer to the grid throughout this video, I borrow Gretchen Bakke's definition. Quote, "It is a machine, an infrastructure, a cultural artifact, a set of business practices, and an ecology. Its tendrils touch us all." This approach allows for an exploration of the grid as an entity which confronts ethical dimensions of energy that, in turn, lead to uneven distributions of risk and responsibility.
We've been talking about energy. Where do we get it? What kind of choices are involved?
Before continuing, I would like to gauge in a core technology of anthropology, namely reflexivity. I grew up in Pasadena, just south of Altadena, for most of my life. I grew up exploring Hahamunga Water Basin over by JPL, walking around the foothills with friends. I was even in Eaton Canyon less than a week before the fire started. I was in Pasadena when the fire was at its peak, volunteering with the Red Cross at Pasadena Convention Center, and stood outside looking up at the glowing mountains. I know several families who lost their homes over the next weeks of burning. I returned in the summer to complete a shortened version of ethnographic research on uncertainty after the fire for my undergraduate dissertation. While I do not quote anyone from that research within this video, I recognize that my conversations with people I love about a place that I love has no doubt shaped my analysis and what I see and don't see. This is not the story of the Eaton fire and risk, just a reflection based on resources available to me and countless hours of research. I will no doubt overlook things, miss out on key literature from other disciplines, and be biased in my analysis. However, the intention of this video is to inspire questions and highlight gaps in assumptions, not provide an answer. Throughout this video, I will follow BAKKE's analysis of the grid as a cultural entity by focusing in on the historical development of California's grid. To conclude, I will return to the uncertain future of Altadena after the Eaton fire and California's grid, given this history and cultural development. Long before the Spanish and American colonizers arrived in the LA Basin, the Chumash and Tongva annually burned brush, regulating fuel buildup and providing necessary nutrients to the soil for better hunting and gathering. The Spanish prohibited this practice, and the Mexicans and then Americans followed. While the ideal solution to Southern California's infernos would include a return to this practice of prescriptive burning, the small risk of runaway fire has meant this indigenous ecological regulation has been limited to unpopulated national forests. As fire ecologist Stephen Pine has highlighted, California experienced approximately 4.2 million burned acres in 2020. While this amount may seem massive on the surface, it is only a fraction of the circa 10 million acres burned annually in pre-industrial times, most of which did not stem from the wild surges so common today. Historian Mike Davis has underlined in his book titled Ecology of Fear that a calm-weathered Southern California is the product of careful advertisement. He says, quote, "To put it brutally, the peaceful land of sunshine is part fluke, part myth. Every recent investigation, whether based on tree rings, lake sediments, seabed varves, or pollen cores, confirms that the Los Angeles region's climate over the past 150 years has been anomalously mild and therefore atypical. Southern California has been defined by disaster and fire. Can these risks, which are so deeply present through California's history, really be considered unprecedented?" The short answer is no. The long answer of how electricity and fire have been culturally registered as an unprecedented risk is more interesting than this answer, however. The story of how Southern California got to this cultural assumption highlights the importance of grid literacy and a historical understanding of the infrastructures of energy, which shape disaster risk as we understand it today. I will first give a quick overview of the initial history of electricity in California before discussing how the big three investor-owned utilities, including Southern California Edison, came to be, their eventual deregulation, and the modern dynamic they occupy with the Wildfire Compensation Fund and California's renewable energy mandate. While historical accounts of the development of electricity in the United States have tended to focus on Edison's Pearl Street station in New York, or the structure of producing electricity in rural areas and using it in urban ones adopted after the Niagara Falls were harnessed. The economic system of the grid developed in Chicago by Samuel Insull. California's grid was ahead of its eastern counterparts in many respects. Long-distance transmission of electricity boomed in the San Bernardino Mountains starting in 1892 and already adopted the alternating current standard still in place today. The first commercial arc lighting system in the nation was installed in San Francisco in 1879, 3 years before Thomas Edison's Pearl Street. By 1892, the 4 largest cities in California had electric train or trolley lines. The intertwining of cheap electricity and transportation made men, such as Henry Huntington with his famous red cars and Pacific Light and Power in Los Angeles, incredibly rich. Where East Coast electricity had the stability of local oil and coal, California relied heavily on hydroelectric power. By the time the First World War eventually rolled around, California hosted a third of the entire world's hydroelectric long-distance systems. In Altadena, just northeast of Los Angeles, this electrical boom at the turn of the 20th century was most clearly seen in the electric incline railway of Mount Lowe. Climbing up the renowned steep embankments of the San Gabriel Mountains, tourists were welcomed into a hotel paradise placed at the now accessible boundary of wilderness and urban space. When Thaddeus Lowe, one of the founders and the railway's namesake, visited the 1893 Chicago World Fair, his eye was caught by an impressive harnessing of the modern magic of electricity, the world's largest searchlight. After purchasing the searchlight and installing it atop Mount Lowe in 1894, the magnificent conversion of electricity into light served as a key advertising tool and a general annoyance to the light-sensitive residents of the valleys below. Southern California Edison itself, who would eventually buy Mount Lowe's electrical infrastructure and Pacific Light and Power from Henry Huntington, captured this romantic vision of electricity and leisure in their 1970s documentary titled To Mount Lowe with Love. Within this documentary, even SCE could not ignore the continual presence of fire in the supposedly conquered modern landscape. Different instances of fire burned down various portions of the mountaintop resort in 1900, 1905, 1935, and 1936, before a final conflagration in 1940 resulted in all remaining structures being sold for scraps. Fire was a regular occurrence in electrified Altadena and would not spontaneously stop, even as the electrical grid continued to be updated. The 1890s was a time of tremendous growth and consolidation of electricity in and around Los Angeles. One large utility would come out on top of Southern California's electrical food chain. The Edison Electric Company in Los Angeles merged with Southern California Power in 1898, before absorbing several smaller utilities and restructuring itself as Southern California Edison in 1909. By 1930, SCE only had 5 regional competitors, most of which were far more local in scale. As electrical engineer Frank Kellogg Brainerd wrote in 1908, quote, "The system of the Edison Electric Company in Southern California as it exists today is the result of the consolidation and growth of several systems. This historical development of the material culture of California's grid, with inconsistent standards and a hodgepodge of diverse systems, continues to haunt California over a century later." Investor-owned utilities were state-supported under the Edison Chicago model, which encouraged large corporations to buy up their smaller neighbors and drive down prices via economies of scale. Electricity became a modern entitlement for American citizens, which overshadowed the potential negatives of vertical and horizontal monopolies. While utilities were protected from competition by law, they were also legally unable to price gouge. The combination of this economic structure and the 20th century cultural value of electricity shaped the big 3 investor-owned utility companies of California as we know them today. They are Pacific Gas and Electric in the north, Southern California Edison, and the smaller San Diego Gas and Electric. When added together, These three utilities provided nearly 73% of all electricity consumed in California throughout 2024. Southern California Edison alone paid out $1.2 billion in common share dividends in 2024. 8 of the 20 most destructive fires in California's modern history can be directly tied back to one of these companies' power lines. The big three are deeply intertwined with California's grid as we know it, with no perceivable change on the horizon. After a policy shift throughout the US in the 1990s, utilities in California went through a process of deregulation. As Gretchen BAKKE describes it, deregulation's aim, quote, was to make a unit of electricity into a tradable commodity with a price set by relations between supply and demand rather than by a utility's regulatory body or by convention. While utilities used to profit when consumers used electricity and more energy we used, the more money they made, they now, quote, make money by transporting power and by trading it as a commodity, end quote. In other words, electricity has been liberalized and financialized, following the economic trends of our day. Once again, understanding the historical development of the grid highlights the cultural frameworks which shape California's relationships to electricity. The most destructive fire in California's history, followed by the Eaton Fire in second place. The Camp Fire of 2018, started by Pacific Gas and Electric's aging transmission lines, completely razed the town of Paradise in Northern California, destroying over 18,000 structures and horrifically killing 85 people. An example of the risk of California's grid development, Pacific Gas and Electric had grown much like Southern California Edison, consuming smaller companies over several decades, including their mismatched technical records. As journalist Catherine Blunt highlighted, Pacific Gas and Electric was, quote, responsible for a vast network of transmission lines that it had no role in building, and many of the records and correspondences the company inherited would eventually get lost or purged with time. The Caribou Palermo line, which failed, had no record of inspection or patrol logs prior to 2001. On June 16, 2020, Pacific Gas and Electric pleaded guilty to 85 accounts of manslaughter, the deadliest corporate crime in American history. The risk management of Pacific Gas and Electric by committee meant that no individual was held accountable. This was a wake-up call for California. The electrical grid and its risk distribution needed to change, or more people would continue to die. Governor Gavin Newsom, in response to the Camp Fire, established the Wildfire Compensation Fund, a multi-billion-dollar fund which utilities can pull from to cover any liabilities related to fires their equipment may have started. This fund is half covered by the utilities themselves and half by the customers, who pay a fee on their electricity bill. As Blunt put it, quote, the point was to assure Wall Street that investor-owned utilities had a future in California. The risk of wildfires and the responsibility of their prevention are typically measured by models and metrics, not in individual stories or unquantifiable impacts. These models and metrics are projected on the future to manage risk and financial liability. SCE manages risk by trying to foresee and control a risky future, which means that the immediate impact of crisis is not included in their narrative of ethical resilience. SCE has promoted a narrative of resilience amid crisis after the Eaton Fire, which portrays a crisis as unprecedented and frames solutions in terms of access to capital, markets, credit, and technocratic expertise. While the Eaton Fire continued to burn through January of 2025, Edison International published a newsletter titled The Facts on Transmission Line Inspections. In this newsletter, they state, quote, SCE has reduced the risk of catastrophic wildfire ignited by its equipment by 85 to 90% compared with pre-2018 levels by following its wildfire mitigation plans. Later, they claim, in 2024, SCE spent more than $1.8 billion mitigating wildfire risks, including inspecting and upgrading transmission and distribution infrastructure more frequently than required by state regulators. Pedro Pizarro, the CEO of Edison International, also called the Eaton Fire a, quote, black swan event of low probability but high consequence, according to the LA Times. Given the history I've explored, the Eaton fire is anything but unprecedented. The electric grid requires a massive amount of capital investment to function and expand. This means that SCE can present its $1.8 billion mitigating wildfire risks as unprecedented, even when they paid around $1.2 billion in common share dividends and invested $4.1 billion in electrical distribution infrastructure that same year. Investor-owned utilities in California, like Southern California Edison, only bear a portion of the financial impact of crisis, even when their risk mitigation is presented as all-encompassing and a wildfire can be traced directly back to their faulty equipment. In my personal view, they present themselves narratively as moral caretakers of the grid.
Together we can brighten the future.
In your struggle to operate profitably and responsibly, with new ideas from Edison, you can do both.
But ignore any responsibilities or risks which have not been financialized through models and metrics. The full risks of the historical development of California's grid are still unrealized. While instances of wildfires started by electricity at the wildland-urban interface continue to be presented as unprecedented, there will be no structural change addressing this history. All these numbers and statistics overlook the deep connections wildfire victims have to land and home, the painful hours spent in financial ruin or limbo, the emotional weight of insurance auditing, and the decades of slow violence that will go into rebuilding. In addition, the Eaton fire has highlighted the cultural risk of wildfires. West Altadena was a historically black neighborhood in an area of otherwise rampant redlining. Right now, there is a civil rights case open in California investigating whether the delays in emergency notifications during the fires stemmed from racist or ageist inaction by the LA County Fire Department. All of this is happening while California's government pushes for renewable energy with a mandate under SB 100 requiring 100% of all energy sources in California to be renewable or carbon neutral by 2045. Edison International has and will continue to profit massively from this required transition. While this transition addresses California's hydrocarbon contribution to climate change, it overlooks the investment required to make the grid and California's relationship to fire less likely to cause immediate crisis. SCE distances itself from the financial liabilities of California's grid by dismissing this risk's deadly manifestations as unprecedented and relying on government support and the Wildfire Compensation Fund, which guarantees the corporation's profits. My exploration has revealed the interconnection of moralizing narratives, financialization, and blurry boundaries between state and private responses in addressing climate change and climate risk in California's electrical grid. No one entity is responsible for the devastation of the Eaton fire, even if Southern California Edison's transmission line was the object that first sparked. No singular person or corporation can manage all the risks associated with living in an electrified space at the wildland-urban interface. Fire will continue to be a part of California's history and a key portion of its ecology. The negotiation of the grid's risk and responsibilities will continue to be a moral project distributed unevenly, one which stems from cultural assumptions and legal structures. Survivors will continue to face an uncertain future, filled with both vulnerability and potential. If you would like to support an organization fighting for the victims of the Eaton fire, I have linked to several below. Thank you for listening. This has been Martin Ladekarl. All images and videos have been used in accordance with fair use. Any and all sources can be found in the description.